Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this ARMC Perspectives webinar, Understanding Business Email Compromise and CEO Fraud. My name is Saldis Jusha Sheriff, and I'm the founder and managing partner of Africa Risk Management and Compliance, or ARMC as we're known. ARMC is a risk management, regulatory compliance, and risk solutions company focused on serving the needs of Africa's financial services sector. As I'm sure you'll agree, from a financial services perspective, cybersecurity is the risk of our time. And that is why we're extremely pleased to be able to deliver this ARMC Perspectives webinar on business email compromise and CEO fraud. We're really excited to be able to share expert speakers with you today. The first of our speakers is Laura Temesi, Head of Cyber Partnerships at Standard Chartered. Laura is going to talk to us a little bit more about business email compromise and about the risks of cybercrime and cyber fraud as seen from the perspective of a large global bank. Laura is a really experienced cybersecurity expert, highly qualified, and we're really excited to be able to hear what she has to say. The second of our speakers is Lars Sandenberg. Lars is Head of Sales at DMARC Advisors and has been a partner of ARMC for many years. Lars is going to talk to us about the email security threat landscape and how the implementation of the DMARC protocol can help us all keep our companies safe from cyber attack. I hope you enjoy this webinar and I hope you find it informative and educative. We look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Spoofing would be where the attacker uses the name of the CEO but uses a completely different email address. So if you're vigilant, you'll notice that if you're expecting an email from Laura Temesi at sc.com, you'll get one from Laura Temesi at ss.com, and you can be able to pick up that this email address is not authentic. But how often do we check the email address line to see whether the email is authentic? And there are times when the email is actually similar to the company's domain with a few different letters. So if you do not notice the fake address, you may easily rush to respond. When it comes to email and name spoofing, which is the second type, the attackers will use both the CEO's name and even their correct sender addresses. So it's very easy to get into a tool or get into a link that allows you to masquerade, and the email coming from me will seem to be coming from my authentic email address. And the attacker in this instance will typically use a reply to address that is different from the sender address, so that when you respond, it goes to the fraudster's email account. Your fraud targets, just by the nature, would definitely be the finance department, human resources department, the executive team, and IT. And I'll explain a little bit why. Finance departments, obviously, they are vulnerable in companies that regularly engage in large wire transfers, and the emails will tend to be requests to send or transfer funds. When it comes to human resources, because they manage databases and access to everyone in the organization, they may receive spoofed emails asking for employee information, such as the payroll information, and then it ends up being leaked. And then when it comes to the executive teams, they possess some kind of financial authority. So if the emails are hacked, cyber criminals will have access to an abundance of confidential information, and they can easily get it because people assume this is a request from an executive and I need to respond immediately. And then obviously for people within the IT department, because of the authority that they have over the access controls, password management, and email accounts, the fraudsters tend to know that if the credentials are hacked, they can gain entry to parts of the organization. Moving on to the next slide, this is an example of an attempt to defraud. So here you can see where from an email perspective, they've used apple.com, and we all know that Apple don't really email people. They have spoofed an email address, and Apple would definitely not be sending emails. And then they'll tell you that your account has been blocked and they want you to validate your account. Obviously, the next logical step will be to key in your email address as well as your credentials. And then the person who's spoofing then has what we typically call the keys to the kingdom. And they'll then be able to get access to your material and your information that is obviously unwarranted. Logically, then we move on to how do we identify CEO fraud. So there are 3 steps, or I'd call it the test of 3, where you first consider the sender, next you look at the email address, and third is to check with another person. So consider the sender. So if typically I don't get such requests via email from the CEO or from my executives, then I need to ask myself, why am I getting this email request from them? If they typically don't send such requests before having a meeting or an engagement, then I need to think twice about it. Then we also need to look at the email address. Does the email address make sense, or does it align in case test number 1 does not pass? Then the third thing is also to check with another person, because if I'm receiving a request from the CEO and I'm a payroll administrator or I'm an accounts payable manager, obviously there's somebody else I can check with, probably the HR director or the financial CFO respectively, to see is this authentic or not. Just sitting into this, when I look at the situation we have playing out, particularly in the continent, which is Africa, is generally we have a culture of trust. So when I get a request coming through, it's culturally, I would not initially be suspicious. I'll want to assist and respond immediately. The other thing that can impact your susceptibility to such fraud is actually organizational culture. So where if the nature of the organization is there's no open bottom-up communication, then it's likely that when somebody gets a request, they will execute it as is without asking. So there's a cultural aspect there within the organization that you need to consider. And even when you're considering what tools to put in place to mitigate against this risk, also consider the country culture, the local culture, and how do people handle things. How is the power distance equilibrium handled within your country? Do you have a scenario where typically people don't question authority? Then you need to make sure that you have complementary tools to ensure that you're able to arrest CEO fraud. And of course, we cannot overemphasize the need for awareness. So in terms of this case study, which is the next step that I'm going to go to, we want to talk about a Snapchat payroll information breach. So we've had very many high-profile business email compromise attacks that will target a company's finance department and request for payment. But this was one scam that also involved money, and the scam resulted in a breach of some highly sensitive data, including employee social security numbers, tax information, salaries, healthcare plans. And Snapchat offered each affected employee 2 years of free credit monitoring and up to $1 million in reimbursement. So you see, the cost of these breaches can be quite expensive. And what tends to happen is, with the existence of data privacy laws, even as an employer, you're accountable to make sure that you keep your employees' information confidential, and they can sue you, and that can result in penalties that tend to be enforced through the data privacy officers or commissioners in the respective countries. Another case that was a near miss in an organization I worked with before that I'd like to mention was the CEO received an email from a global head requesting him, and that was a couple of years back, requesting him to respond urgently to a request to onboard a consultant that's assisting with strategy, and they needed to send a certain amount of money. It was pretty high. It was almost to the tune of roughly about $90,000, $90,000 actually. So they were requested to send some mobilization payment, and they responded and said, I'll look into it. That email came late at night. Then in the morning, the consultant emails and asks, where are you with this? I was told by the CEO that you would support me with the process, and copied to the legitimate global CEO's email account. Obviously, it did not reach the global CEO's account because there was something off with the email details. But obviously, the CEO noticed that, this has been copied to somebody more senior to me. They responded at 5:30 in the morning and said I'd look into it. Then they received a reminder from the global CEO's supposed account asking them, why don't you execute this because we need to execute with speed. And guess what? That tagline, execute with speed, is something that the global CEO used to use regularly. So it sounds very familiar. So what he did is he decided to text and told this individual, what you're asking me to do seems a little bit off. We may need to have a documented process around it. Can we have a call? And then this individual responds on WhatsApp and says, what are you talking about? We've not engaged in the last 2 weeks. So he asks him, are you sure you've not communicated with me? And he says, no, we've not communicated at all, only to realize that he was almost being a victim of a CEO fraud. So this is something that affects even the most vigilant of us, and we then need to be careful about it. But what does this mean for financial institutions and customers, and what are the impacts? We've talked about brand reputation damage, regulatory fines, employees can lose their jobs, financial loss of trust, and lawsuits. And particularly in this regime where regulators expect us to report of such incidents, there is bound to be a loss of trust even from your customers. How do we prevent it? Payment requests received by email should be independently verified. Let's not be pressured by urgent requests, even if they appear to originate from a senior person. Always better to err on the side of caution. Important to remain conscious of how much information you reveal about your company and key officials via the social media platforms. And then training staff. We can't overemphasize awareness and establishing a strict payment release process, because more often than not, the business email compromise, the ultimate objective is to get some financial gain. And logically, then I will transition into the technical tools that are sometimes used, because we are aware that security is layered. And that is the reason why, even if we train people as much as we can on phishing and how to prevent phishing attacks, we will also build in place tools and install them on the network to be able to arrest when one control fails. So at this point, I'll hand over to Lars, who's going to take us through technical tools. Welcome, Lars. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you, Laura, for the great presentation, as it is a great starting point for me to talk about the name and email spoofing and solution there. And yeah, thanks for having me again, Saldis, and Africa Risk Management and Compliance. Yeah, it's always a pleasure to be here again. So thanks for that. My name is Lars Sandbergen. I'm Sales Director at DMARC Advisor, based in the Netherlands, and we are actually helping companies with protecting their online brand and their outbound email against phishing and spoofing by a free protocol, an open security protocol called DMARC, and we build a tool around that. Next slide, please. Let's start with the agenda. I will first tell something about the importance of domains. Then I will tell you something about the history of email, as it is important to understand why it's happening. Then I will tell you quickly about impersonation, the life cycle of a phishing attack, and then about the email authentication protocols there are, and then I will go and talk about DMARC, how it works, and how an implementation process looks like. Next slide, please. Thanks, Aldis. So first about domains. Domains are really important for a business. So every business talks about their trademarks, for example, their brand trademarks, that's offline. But a domain is actually your online trademark. And a lot is connected with your domain. So for example, here you can see the domain africariskmanagers.com. It's owned by Africa Risk Managers, but their website is connected to it, but also the email is connected to it. And that's important to know if we talk about name and email spoofing. Next slide, please. Therefore, use domains also as important assets instead of just a domain. Then 91% of the cyber attacks starts with phishing. Email is still the #1 communication channel for businesses, but also for individuals. Next slide, please. So email is really important within businesses. Email You can directly go to the next slide, please. So email is developed in 1981. It's a while ago, and it was just developed to send a message from a person to a person. Not keeping in mind that it could be abused, or that so much businesses would start using email for their business. And not keeping in mind that it could be abused in the future. So therefore it has a lot of gaps, and that makes it possible for cyber criminals to name an email spoof a domain. Next slide, please. So like I said, email is broken, but we're fixing. And during the time, a lot of people helped to make it a safer place for all of us by developing and designing new open security protocols, which are, or at least trying to fill the gaps that SMTP left. Next one, please. Because of those gaps, it's possible for a cyber criminal to, like Laura said, to name an email spoof a domain. So it looks like the email really comes from that person by, for example, seldis@africariskmanagers.com, but it actually came from a cyber criminal. So that makes it really difficult for the receiver to see if an email really came from Seldis or not. Next slide, please. So for every email that you get, you have to check, okay, is this email legitimate or is it illegitimate? And could you be the victim because of that illegitimate email? Next slide, please. One of the well-known examples is the transfer from Stefan de Vrij, a Dutch football player, from Feyenoord to Lazio Roma. It cost around 8.5 million for the full transfer, but the full amount was split in a few parts. So the last part was 2 million. There was an email sent on behalf of Feyenoord, or it looks like it came from Feyenoord, but it actually came from cyber criminals. So Lazio became a victim of it and transferred the 2 million euros to the cyber criminals directly. That's one of the examples, and that's actually loss of money, a lot of money. But it could also be lists of personal data. For example, an email from a CEO to someone from human resources asking for the full list of employees with contact details to send them a present with Christmas or something. Then you can lose a lot of personal data, and it can also damage your reputation as a company / brand. Next slide, please. I thought it would be good to show you an average life cycle of a phishing attack from left to right, so you can see where it starts, what the safe zone is, and what actually the danger zone is. But the cyber criminal always starts with creating a phishing website. So actually a website that looks real, it's on a weird, different URL, but they launch that website and it looks real, so people fall for it. Then they send an email, so a whole bunch of emails with a link to that website on behalf of the company to recipients. Then you're still in the safe zone, because the sending mail server, so they are sending the email with the link to that fake website. They are sending it from the sending mail server to the receiving mail server. You see the 2 dots in the middle. And behind that receiving mail server is a person who acts on the fake email. So you have a few layers of security. And the thought of the developers of DMARC, so the Open Security Protocol DMARC, was, okay, let's bring a line of defense in the safe zone, so that you don't have to be aware of if an email really came from the company or not. So DMARC, the Open Security Protocol, is somewhere between the sending mail server and the receiving mail server. Next slide, please. So here you can see this is actually the part where DMARC is on. It's between sending the fake email and receiving the fake email by the mail server. So before actually the employee or the customer can react on the email. Next one, please. Like I said, in the last 20 years, a few open security protocols were developed, starting with SPF. On itself, it wasn't strong enough to prevent spoofing and to solve the problem of spoofing. After that, DKIM came in, so domain keys identifier mail. Also, that was not strong enough to solve the problem of spoofing, because they are both on domains that you only can see in the headers, and who's checking email headers, especially the people who are not technical, which is 99% of the people, the world population. And then DMARC was developed, and DMARC actually makes the connection between SPF and DKIM and the domain which is visible in the email client of the recipient. Next one. So DMARC on itself is an open security protocol, like I said. Everyone can implement it for free if you have the knowledge and if you can read XML reports. I will tell you more about that. But it's actually free. We build a tool that makes it easier to implement it. So, of course, there are some businesses who saw, okay, we can help companies with implementing it, but in basis, it's free. Next one. How does it work? This is the email ecosystem explained in a graph. There are 3 parties involved in the email ecosystem, starting with brands. So, for example, Standard Chartered, Africa Risk Managers and Compliance, those 2 are brands. They own domains, and those domains, so they send emails on behalf of those domains. They're probably, they are always using senders to send out email. And with a sender, you can think about, for example, MailChimp to send out newsletters, Office 365 to send out corporate emails, SendGrid, Google, whatever. And with those senders, they are sending email to the receivers. And business to consumer, you can think about Gmail, Hotmail, Outlook, Live, all those personal mailboxes. Business to business, you can think about Google, Office 365, and all those big ones. And what DMARC does, with DMARC, you as a brand, you only have access to your DNS, so you can decide, okay, those senders are legitimate. You make the senders easy to identify for the receivers as legitimate by configuring SPF and DKIM per sender. And that allows the receiver to block, because they see a sender, they see an email coming in from a sender that is not legitimate, because SPF and DKIM isn't there, or to accept that email. So you actually bring in an extra layer of security before the user can fall for a trap. Those receivers are sending feedback. So, for example, Google is sending feedback to the brand about who or what is sending email on behalf of the brand. That's actually what DMARC does. Let's go a bit more into detail. Next slide, please. With DMARC, you get reports, so you get insight into who or what is sending on behalf of your domains. And based on that insight, you make the legitimate mail flows easy to identify with SPF and DKIM. And therefore, you have some protection, because the receiver knows what to do with an email if it fails DMARC. Let's quickly introduce SPF and DKIM on itself. So with SPF, it's a text record into your DNS, where you tell the internet which servers are allowed to send email on behalf of your domain. And with DKIM, also records into your DNS that actually verifies that the content is still the same. So if the content is changed of the email, then DKIM will fail. So then you can't rely anymore on DKIM. Next slide, please. On the left-hand side, you can see the reports that you get from the receivers as a domain owner, and those reports are non-consumable for most of the people. What we do is we translate those XML reports into understandable graphics based on our database. So we know that a lot of, so for example, IP4 1.2.3.4 is used by Office 365. We see that in the reports and we know, okay, you as a company with your domain, you are using Office 365 to send out email. Next one. So you get insight into all the different mail flows on behalf of your domain. So in this case, in the left picture, you can see SendGrid, we can see Google, FlowMailer, and some other senders. But you also get insight into the bad actors who are trying to send out on behalf of your domain. So in the right picture, you can see the red graph. Here you can see, okay, there are a lot of spoofed emails sent out on behalf of your domain from everywhere in the world. Next one. What you do with DMARC is, so only the legitimate senders, only those are, so you only need to configure those with SPF and DKIM to make them easy to identify. As soon as you change your policy, and with your policy you tell the receiver what to do with an email if it fails, as soon as you change that one, all the others will be blocked. So only the well-configured ones are accepted by the receiving mail party. So what we think, and I think that's a common thought, is that you as a company, as a brand, you need to take your responsibility to make the email ecosystem a safer place for all of us. So you need to make sure that your brand, so that no cyber criminal can use your brand to send out spoofed emails and fake emails, because your suppliers, your customers, your employees, your partners, you don't want them to fall for and become a victim of spoofed emails on behalf of your own brand name, because that can cause a lot of brand damage. When you start with DMARC, you always start with P equals none, and that actually means, okay, the receiving mail party don't do anything, so always accept your email, you just get the reports. Next one, please. So a DMARC implementation, like I said, you have to do things and you have to configure SPF and DKIM for all the legitimate sources. So how a DMARC implementation project looks like really depends on the size of your company. You can imagine that a huge enterprise with a lot of employees working from everywhere in the world is using a lot of senders. So for all the senders, you have to configure SPF and DKIM. So that's more work than when you are a small company with only 2 mail flows. For example, your corporate email sent from Office 365 and only a mail flow with invoices from a specific third-party sender. So it depends on the size of your company, the amount of domains you use to send out email, the amount of third-party senders, like I said, that you use legitimately, how your DNS change processes internally. Some huge enterprises have long change processes, but for smaller companies it can be just clicking the fingers. And of course it depends on the internal knowledge about email authentication. And we would really love to help you with getting that knowledge. Of course, it can be a difficult project, especially for the bigger organizations, but it's a need to, because it's your responsibility to protect everyone where you do business with. Next one, please. Yes, so DMARC Advisor, our company, we developed an implementation guide based on 10 years experience with implementing DMARC for big multinationals, governmental institutions, small and medium organizations. It was a 50-pager. It's not that long anymore, so don't worry. But if you want to implement DMARC for your company, it could be a really useful document that helps you actually step by step to implement DKIM and so protect your brand. If you want to have access, it's behind the login wall. Please contact Africa Risk Managers and Compliance for free access to this guide, because it's all about awareness. We want companies to implement it and so protect their connections. So please do. Next one, please. And then the last thing, if you want to know about the status and if your company is protected against spoofing by DMARC, you can simply use the domain check on our website. Just fill in the domain. So in the case of info@africariskmanagers.com, the domain is africariskmanagers.com. Fill it in and check your domain. If you haven't implemented DMARC or you're still on P== none, then there's some work to do. So please contact Africa Risk Managers if you need help or if you want to learn more. We're happy to assist. So that's my thing. Thanks for listening all.